Chances are, if you've ever been a Nintendo fan, it started from childhood, with the company creating some of your favorite consoles and games that you possibly still love today, and that's true for me too. As far back as my memory goes, Nintendo has been involved, and I'm a 34-year-old man, so it's been a long journey. And while I've expanded my horizons beyond Nintendo, returning to their ecosystem can still be an oddly comforting experience. However, I'd be lying if I said my relationship with them today is the same as it always has been. It's pretty rare for me to get excited about anything Nintendo is doing, and while I'm okay with that now, when I was younger, it was something I was really afraid of happening. I think there's a high chance diehard Nintendo fans have or will experience some level of fallout with the company. Over my life, I've talked to people who think Nintendo's peak was during the Super Nintendo, GameCube, and sometimes even the Wii U and 3DS. Often it feels like it leaves a feeling that modern Nintendo has somehow gone astray from what they loved about them. This isn't a phenomenon limited to Nintendo either. Sega, Sony, Square Enix, maybe the game industry as a whole often end up with some portion of their audience creating a similar narrative. Growing up, I had trouble understanding why people felt this way, but usually their response would boil down to something like, the games they make today suck, or they were somehow objectively worse. Admittedly, the online discourse I was exposed to back then was much less nuanced than what I see today, including whatever I was saying. But even as a kid, I was never really satisfied with this explanation. It always felt like someone was getting old or growing out of touch. But I get old too, so part of me feared this feeling would eventually envelop me, and to some extent, that time has come. I barely care about most of Nintendo's modern games. I do generally feel positive about them, but it's clear my flame as a fan has greatly dwindled. So I'm here today to answer my younger self. Why do I think I feel this way? I want to talk about a very specific time in Nintendo's history and how that led me down the path to become who I am today. 2004 to 2006 was probably when I was the most hardcore of Nintendo fan. The GameCube was a huge part of my early teenage years, and the DS had just launched. Despite the weirdness of its two screens and touch controls, I was happy to accept it. Ultimately, it still looked and felt like a next-gen Game Boy with more buttons and being fully capable of 3D graphics. This is also when I discovered the online news cycles surrounding games, realizing that people were posting game announcements and discussing them on the internet every day. As someone who largely played Nintendo consoles, I became incredibly invested in everything coming out on Nintendo systems and what Nintendo was saying about themselves as a company. Like many overly invested fans at the time, I was excited at Reggie Fils-Aimé's bombastic stage introduction at E3. I also really loved Satoru Iwata's Game Developer Conference presentation, in which he told the story of his humble beginnings as a programmer at HAL Laboratories and how that led him to becoming the CEO of Nintendo. It had a huge impact on me, establishing him as an early role model in my teenage years. I was hooked on Nintendo messaging. At this time in particular, it was all about expanding the game industry. When Nintendo revealed the Wii Remote at Tokyo Game Show, I was shocked. What the heck is this? I knew Nintendo was saying their controller would be innovative, but how do they build a meaningful game experience around a vertical stick you swing around? And that night I laid there staring at the ceiling, wondering, is Nintendo still for me? I even called my dad the next day, who was across the country and likely had no concept of what I was panicking over. In hindsight, it all sounds super silly, but Nintendo, for better or for worse, was a huge part of my life, and it felt like they were upending everything I knew overnight. In some ways, this very well could have been the end of my Nintendo fandom. Who knows where games would have taken me afterwards, but that next day, I calmed down. And in full Nintendo fanboy fashion, I said to myself, Nintendo knows what's best. I'll trust them. However, this was not spontaneous faith I placed in them. Nintendo knew nearly every person would have some reaction to this change in direction, including negativity or confusion. Starting with the DS, they began an extensive messaging campaign to press and investors about their new approach. They specifically referenced the Blue Ocean Strategy marketing book. The short version of this book is that the best way to achieve market success is to find large, underserved demographics with the least competition. Basically, don't compete directly with Microsoft and Sony, compete around them, something they still do today. But all of this messaging showed Nintendo had a plan. The success of titles like Nintendogs and Brain Age on the DS reinforced it as a legitimate approach. Despite the Wii Remote reveal being a down moment for me, I was mostly already bought in. At the Wii's launch, I loved its exciting, fun, and charming user interface, as well as its early system-defining games like Wii Sports, which felt like they defined the direction of that system for every company developing for it. But at the same time, I was a little confused because Nintendo was also putting out a lot of titles that didn't feel like it fit that direction or Nintendo's core message. A key word Nintendo relied on at this time was innovation, creating all new and exciting game experiences for new consumers. But then, sometimes they'd make a new Super Mario Bros., which would be a very standard 2D Mario game. Or they'd put out a Mario Kart, which would sometimes have some cool features or unique modes, but ultimately it didn't change the core racing experience of that series. Especially when you look at something like Excite Truck, which kind of rethought the whole way you get first place in a racing game. Animal Crossing on the DS maybe left me the most baffled though. The online mode seemed like the big selling point. I was someone who had seen how in the mid-2000s, full-scale MMORPGs like Final Fantasy XI had built player-populated worlds that encouraged tight-knit communities. In my mind, Nintendo, being the innovative company it was, would transform Animal Crossing, creating a community experience where each player's daily happenings would be relevant and impactful to each other. Instead, it felt like we got a portable iteration of the first game, with the online component more or less being a way for you to show off your town, like a trophy, or abuse the turnip market, something I think the series has only since doubled down on. I kept feeling like anytime Nintendo did something that blew me away, there were 2, 3, or maybe even sometimes more games in between that felt like they focused on building only on what Nintendo had done before. I think in my head, a lot of the messaging Nintendo was doing at this time got mixed together. The Blue Ocean strategy is not necessarily a game design philosophy, it's a marketing one. For successful franchises that Nintendo already dominates with, why risk that for the sake of innovation? You already have the market. But over time, it felt like Nintendo's focus on these innovative and new experiences began to fade away. There are a lot of reasons why I likely felt this way, Nintendo pulling back on this messaging around 2010, and I think my growing understanding of the game industry as a whole likely playing a role. But all I knew then was that it felt like the vision of brand new and innovative experiences that Nintendo sold me on was being pushed aside. For well over a decade, I think this idea that Nintendo abandoned the thing I loved about them ultimately stuck with me. So much so that it's rare I viewed them positively. I thought their success with the Switch might restore my excitement for their titles, but that feeling didn't really return. That's not to say nothing Nintendo did on the platform interested me. I always thought Nintendo Labo was very cool. I also love Buddy Mission Bond, a bizarre shot they took of the boys' love market, creating a team of incredibly handsome men who may or may not be dating. I also really like DC superhero girls, but I viewed games like these as interesting curiosities at best, side projects to what Nintendo was, rather than what I viewed them to be. A significantly safer version of a company I used to love. But when I reflect on the frustrations I had with the DS and Wii lineup, I see something very similar to what I see in Nintendo today. They're a publisher with a broad range of titles, including tried and true accessible multiplayer games, re-releases and remakes that celebrate their legacy, and games that restructure their core franchises while trying to stay true to some original semblance of what they were. What I really cared about probably was the narrative built around the DS and Wii. These two systems were some of the most massively coordinated attempts by a console manufacturer or a game publisher to reach a broader audience. They had the hardware, software, and messaging to tell this story, and they absolutely succeeded in reaching their audience. But in the end, as wide-reaching as that story was, in reality, it was only a small part of Nintendo's identity even then. Ironically, I think this acceptance of this narrative, which I thought I had to accept to keep loving Nintendo, probably is a big part of why I moved so far away from them today. I know not everyone is a hyper-fixated person talking about video games and Nintendo on the internet, but if you're watching this video, there's a good chance you are, have been, or know someone who is. But these narratives about who game companies are, including what they value and represent, weirdly can give a feeling of being closer to them in the moment, especially when joining communities that start to build up around them. Obviously, Nintendo is not my or your friend, but when I was deeply invested in them, the feeling that they're shifting away from their core values had a big impact on how I viewed their games, as well as the people who make or played them. I'm sure every person's different, but I feel like the gut reaction we have to these situations can be to look externally first. What has changed about Nintendo? And sure, the types of games they make today have shifted. The industry as a whole has shifted. But what can be harder for me to recognize, at least, is looking internally to understand what's changed or hasn't changed about myself. I think that is also a very important part to understanding how we view the world. I have many videos that, intentionally or not, challenge a developer's direction, likely based on these personal, internal feelings, maybe going as far as to questioning the logic of the people who enjoyed them. Even today, I struggle to find that line of legitimate criticism versus degrading something for not being what I want it to be. Now, don't get me wrong, I love trying to bring new perspectives to how a game is looked at, whether that be a positive or a negative experience. All the different ways I and other people appreciate games is a big part of what I love about video game discourse, but at the same time, I need to know when to challenge my own view and ask if I'm really criticizing the right thing here. I lived through the era of the Wii being undermined in discussions by the core gaming audience, since often the titles didn't fit their view of what they considered to be good games. So I think it's really important for me to respect, value, and at least try to understand what fans love about their favorite games and the people that make them. And it is something I'm actively trying to do. I recently did a podcast where I talked to Josie of the Josie Woe channel to better understand what she loves about Nintendo as a younger Nintendo fan. And in a lot of ways, it was really insightful. But I'm sure I'll fail at being considerate about that thing in the future. I'm only human. But when I recognize it, I need to think about why I feel that way, while putting faith in myself and others that we're being genuine about how we feel, even if we don't always have the right words to express what that is. However, to be clear, this isn't a past I regret. My relationship with Nintendo has been strained for sure, but my primary reaction to that was to instead look elsewhere for games that valued what I did. As Nintendo moved to the Wii U and 3DS, the Wii and DS gained new life for me. The primary reason I still love the systems today is the unending backlog of titles from third-party publishers trying to unlock this expanded audience Nintendo had sold to them. It's fascinating to see how each developer tried to take what they knew about game design and connect it with a new audience, though not everyone reaped the rewards. I also use these values to connect me to all sorts of other video games, old and new, that challenge my expectation of what makes a fun video game. I've learned to love licensed games for kids, romantic adventure games, gambling games, sexy anime girl games, and even a metaverse celebrating the 100-year legacy of a Japanese snack company. I'm often confused initially, but I love sitting down and trying to understand what players and the people who made these games find valuable in them. And from that, I often can enjoy them too. If anything, my gaming life today is better than it ever was 10 or 20 years ago. I can't say for sure, but I'd like to think in some ways, the excitement I had around the Wii and DS is part of what drives me to explore new games I may have never played otherwise. I think one of the most powerful feelings can be taking responsibility to find your own happiness. I'm honestly still processing my thoughts on modern Nintendo, and who knows if they may or may not be a part of my gaming life in the future, but there's a whole games industry out there. It's a lot of trial and error, but I love looking for titles, developers, people, and communities that resonate with me. And if that ever changes, I need to evaluate who I am and why to make sure whatever I'm doing is the thing I'm happiest spending my time and energy on. Maybe that's something that's not video games, but at least today, I still love them. Thanks to Demodor and Conspicuous Snoop for helping making this video happen. If you want to help me make videos more often, Ko-fi donations is the best way to do that. Otherwise, check out that podcast I mentioned earlier with Josie, as well as maybe check out my Buddy Mission Bond video. I think that's a really cool game. I think you'd really appreciate it too.